Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we're covering Tinto Talks 22 for the super secret Project Caesar, aka EU5, and this week we're going to get a lot more information about how combat works. Johan does call out that in a previous Tinto Talks, the 11th one, we did get a general overview of the military, and there is a link to that here if you do want to refresh yourself on how that works. I will, as always, leave a link to this in the description down below, and I also did cover this in a video. I will link that as well down there if you do want to get a bit of a refresher. He does also call out here that they took a lot of influence from other games they've worked on and other games they've made at Paradox. So they've taken Combat and Organization from March of the Eagles. I never played that game. I think that got a bit of a rough reception when it was released, but I guess the Combat and Organization side of it did well. So they have brought some stuff from there. They've brought ideas about the connection between regiments and population from Victoria. That makes a lot of sense. And logistics and automation from Imperator. They're going to get into that a little bit later on. So we'll talk about that then. But that is fantastic to hear. How you controlled your armies in Imperator Rome was fantastic. So if they bring the best sides of that, that's going to make this game even better. And he does say they brought bits from all of those games to try and make the combat and military side of the game the best that it can be, taking these good ideas, putting them together, and making like the ultimate Ultron version of military combat in any Paradox game. It's going to be very interesting to see how they do mash these together, but the information we see in this dev diary does make me pretty hopeful for it. Let's get into it anyway. The first thing they're going to cover here is the actual regiments themselves and how big they can be. Levies can be raised in any provincial capital. Mercenaries can be raised in any capital, city or town. And the regiments, they can be raised in anywhere that you have the infrastructure, the buildings, to actually allow recruitment to happen in those locations. Regular regiments can be as low as 100 men at the start, whereas levies can be up to 1,000 per regiment for the start for most people. The Chinese can have larger levy regiments up to 1,500. He does say here, why did they do that? Why do they have these different sizes depending on what kind of units you have? Well, that's because calling up a levy as Poland, you get 11,000 men, which is 110 regiments. That's quite a lot, but you could live with it. But these larger places like Delhi, the Mamluks, they can have 700 regiments and they could have 1,000 people in them. And then you could have the Chinese, they could have 1,800 regiments. At that point, it gets very cumbersome to control. So that is why they've scaled it. So the early game, where the levies are much bigger, they are in less units, if you want to think of it that way. Whereas later on, where the regiments are smaller amounts of men, but you'll have less of them, you know, less of these stacks, it's going to kind of like balance out. So I imagine early game and late game, you're probably going to have like the same amount of units, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. But they're going to have different like stacks of units within them, but it just makes it more manageable. As they're saying here, if you're playing as these larger countries earlier on in the game, you'd have so many regiments. If a levy was 100 men, just think of how many regiments you'd have of 100 levies. Whereas later game, yes, these regiments are only of like 100 men. It can scale up from that. It does say that's as low as they go. But obviously later on, your professional armies are smaller for the most part than these huge levies that nations could call up during the earlier time frame this game is going to start in. We do know obviously already that EU5 is going to start earlier than EU4, so that is why you're going to have these larger levy armies and then the smaller professional armies as you get further into the game. That is why this kind of flexes up. There's a lot of information here, but really the TLDR is that the units kind of can flex in size to make it just more manageable as a player. So you're not having these massive amounts of units moving around the map early game. And then later on, it's kind of corrected just by the progression of nations and the progression of army kind of makeup later on in the game. Now, the next thing they're going to talk about before they actually get into the combat itself, yes, this was a combat dev diary, but at least half of it is about non-combat things, really, not like the actual mechanics of combat. This one is a major change, and I'm kind of surprised it wasn't covered earlier, but I suppose it didn't really affect any systems before we got to this point, and that is that the clock, the actual progression of time in the game, that's always been daily, or I believe it always has been in Europa Universalis. In Crusader Kings, it's daily as well. So if you have the game unpaused, you just see the days tick over. Now, in EU5, this is actually changing, and it's a combination of daily and hourly. So the days will actually progress, if you want to think of it that way, between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. And then the rest of that time frame, so from 7 p.m. to 8 in the morning, that's like one block of time that kind of skips over quickly, almost as like 1 hour condensed, if you want to think of it that way. And they've done this because they want you to have more control over your armies during these big wars, especially during these like Napoleonic wars where you've got armies all over the place. You're trying to micromanage them as much as you can and things like that. They thought this was a good kind of compromise between having hours all the time or just having these days at a time, which really takes away some of your ability to micromanage these larger wars. So that is a pretty big change. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's going to take a little bit of getting used to having that skip from 7 o'clock to 8 in the morning. That is going to take a bit of time to get used to, but I do like the fact they've kind of split it out, at least for half the day, so you do get more control over your units, trying to decide where they're going, especially during these large total warfare scenarios that you're going to get in Europe, especially being able to control your armies, where they're going, a lot more granular than previously. If you think about it that way, it is going to help you do that. So a good change. We'll see how it actually plays out. It is going to take a little bit of time to get used to, I think. The next thing they're going to talk about is actually a teaser for the next Tinto Talks. Well, not the next one, a future one, I should say. And that is that we're going to get an objective system for our armies that uses the same AI components that the AI itself uses. So a little bit of a, spicy Johan tease here. What is he talking about? Now, if you look at a previous game he made, Imperator Rome, and he did call this out earlier, that they were bringing automation from that game into this one, I believe what they're going to take is the objective system from that and merge it into this objective system. So I'll put some of these on the screen at the moment. So one of the fantastic bits about Imperator Rome was the ability to kind of automate some of your army. Now, it made more sense in that game because it was based in Roman times. You had these generals like Caesar who pretty much controlled armies themselves and kind of loosely did what Rome told them to do. And a fantastic feature in that game is that if you had disloyal generals, they'd actually just take control of the army that they were in control of and just do whatever they wanted until they liked you enough, and then they'd come back into the fold. Now, we're not going to see anything like that, I wouldn't imagine, but I'll put on the screen now the available objectives that you could get in Imperator, and you can look at these as we're talking through them and think like, how would these work in EU5? And some of these are going to be amazing if they do bring a system like this in, and I believe they will do, just from what Johan's saying there. So you could have no objective. That's where they would just work as normal. They just stay still unless you told them to do something. Independent operations, this is where the general could basically do whatever he wanted. You just say this, and then they'd be a computer-controlled army under your nation. So this is how you could automate quite a bit of your army if you wanted to, and they just go off and fight the war for you. And maybe you could concentrate on one army that you wanted to. The third one is defend borders. This army will stay within friendly borders, fighting enemy armies that enter and retaking occupied territories. Think of these for some of the larger colonial empires. If you're England, you're fighting a war on the continent, but you've got America, you're trying to expand there. Maybe you've got some wars going on in India or somewhere. You can automate those and say, look, if a random army appears in India, have this army set aside and they'll just fight them and then retake any occupied territory that they might have taken. The fourth one is carpet siege. This is obviously where they just go out and siege as much as they can. I believe in Imperator, they try to avoid combat. So if an army came close, they just run off and then try and siege things down afterwards. Again, you can see how this would be fantastic for these larger wars. You could take down some forts and then set an army. Can you just carpet siege all this area for me, please? I don't want to micromanage it myself. The next one is reconnaissance. This is where they would patrol your borders. And then I believe you got a notification and it popped up and said like, oh, they've spotted an army in this area. You might want to go take a look at this. This again would be great for these large land areas. Maybe if you're thinking of playing as like Russia or something, take all the Russian Empire land. You could set an army on this. And then if you're going to war with somebody who could potentially bring an army on like the east coast of it, you could have an army patrolling that. And then if that other army turned up, you would get a notification and say like, oh, watch out, an army's appeared here. Maybe you're zoomed into Europe again, and that would give you a little prod to go look elsewhere. Keep in reserve. This is kind of like defend borders, but these armies would stay within your borders and they would avoid fight at all costs unless they were vastly superior to any army that entered your realm. So again, kind of like defend borders, but even more defensive than that. They wouldn't fight. They just kind of move around your realm and avoid getting into fights as much as they can. So if you look at these, I think even if we got just this system as it is, that would be a fantastic addition to EU5, because I'm sure we've all been in these wars that have just kind of gone on forever. You take down forts, you're trying to siege down a massive swathe of land, and you're just having to like micromanage, click on each bit of land, siege it down, next one, next one, next one, next one, all these kind of things. And if you could just automate that, that would be fantastic. The defensive borders as well, or even just the independent operations. What I think would be really cool is if you could declare a war. Maybe it's like a really inconsequential war. Maybe you're England and you're just picking off all the minor Irish counties or something like that. And yes, you can do it yourself, but you're always going to win because you're England. They've got no allies. Maybe you could declare the war and there's like a toggle on it and you could say like automate this war. And then when you declared the war, the AI would just raise your army, go fight this war. When they've won, it would just pop up and say, hey, I've won this war for you, my lord. Click here to accept, and then the war just ends. I think that would be a fantastic addition, especially if we're getting rid of these minor battles, revolts and things like that. You could have these armies set up where they just automatically go off and fight these revolts. You could do that in Imperator Rome as well, and that was fantastic. If a revolt popped up, your army would just go off and fight them and come back, and you didn't even have to worry about it if you didn't want to. So if we do get something like this, it's going to be such a great addition. Do let me know what you think in the comments down below. But like I say, even if it just comes across with those examples and really getting rid of some of the kind of tedious micromanage from doing these larger wars, or even just like annoying things that pop up like rebellions. But as Johan says, we'll find out a lot more about that in the future. It's not going to be the next one. I will say the next dev diary, he already calls out at the end of this, is going to be around logistics and sieges. Siege is a massive part of Europa Universalis games, so we're going to find out a lot more about how they work next week. But let's get back to this one. An army is a group of regiments that can be organized as a single entity. That makes sense if you've played any Paradox game. These can be led by a character who may or may not have traits for being a general. If they don't have any traits, they may get one after a large battle. So even if you put a generic character in there, we will see that in a second in the next screenshot, but if they don't have any traits, they will actually get one in the next battle they fight. I wonder if this will be affected. So if you're fighting in a desert, I wonder if there's a chance or a higher chance that they will get kind of a desert-themed trait. We don't really know what the traits are or how they affect things. It'd be cool if they were kind of themed around where their first battle happened, or maybe what happened in that battle. If they overpower them, if they do a lot of casualties, maybe they get something themed around that. Again, we'll find out later on. The ability of the characters have a lot of impact on the military aspects of the game, and each attribute has at least 3 different benefits. And as you can see in this screenshot, this is Sir John. He is a general in an army here, and you can see here the admin, diplomatic, and military level of this character goes up to 100. We saw this last week with explorers, how these numbers affected explorers, and again, you can see here they affect every area of combat, but split into these different areas. So admin, that affects maintenance, siege ability, frontage. They're going to talk about that in a second, and they're going to give us a bit more of a breakdown about that at the end of the dev diary. And then correct section chance, this is which flank they're in the army, to give a little bit of a spoiler of what's going to be covered later on. Diplomatic, that is army morale, initiative, and food consumption, so your supply limit really. And then military ability, their speed, discipline, and combat speed. Again, combat speed is going to be covered later on in a bit more detail as well. But as you can see from this, a lot of things that are in EU4, some of them with slightly different names. Frontage is kind of like combat width, if you think of it that way. But a lot of these other things you've seen in EU4, nothing too surprising. It is cool how they've split them between these 3 traits. So you can look at this and think like, well, maybe I've got one of these armies. I just have them in reserve. I just have them on reconnaissance. I don't want the army to be that big. I don't need them to be even that good at fighting. So maybe for that, you could put a general there that's just good at admin ability. Now, obviously, we'd always want a fantastic general on every army, but that isn't going to be the case for most armies. But if you have like this just border patrolling army, maybe you just have a really good admin level general, save the maintenance. It doesn't matter if they're actually good at fighting, because I just want them to be scouting out all the time, and then I'll bring my actual army to go fight whatever they find. And then think of other ones. Maybe I want an army that's very good at moving quickly, and I don't care about the other things quite as much. Again, if I have a good military focused one, that could be good there. You can see how you could like pick and choose some of these. If you haven't got that really good general who's good at everything, you could choose ones depending on what you're going to do in that army. That's going to bring a bit more interest, I think, into picking generals. It's not just going to be like how many pips they've got. I've rolled the dice. Oh, he's got 4 pips. Great. He's a great general. Let's put him in that army. Good times are happening. In here, you're going to have these 3 levels affecting different parts of your army and trying to balance them out and pick the best choice for whatever that army's getting up to, a bit more situational. And then speaking of regiments, these can be deployed in one of 4 parts of an army. They are going to be the left flank, the right flank, and the center flank. And then you also have reserve regiments as well. You can micromanage your army in detail, kind of moving them into whichever flank you want. Or, as you will see in this UI, you can balance unit, and that will just kind of spread them out evenly towards this. Now, if you play Crusader Kings 2, there was actually a system kind of like this, I believe, that was very kind of hidden off. I would imagine there's probably a good chunk of Crusader Kings 2 players that maybe didn't even realize this ability was in there. You had the army UI, and then there was a button on there. I can't remember exactly anymore where it was, but you could click it, and then you could move your units within the army. So you could have them on the left, the right flank, the center one, and you could micromanage with the generals and things and actually make a way better army out of the same units. I would imagine 99% of players never did that, but this does remind me a little bit of that system. So it is interesting how that has kind of come back a little bit in this system by the looks of it. And then as you can see in this UI here, you've got the formation on the left-hand side. So I guess that's where you could choose where they go manually, as they were just discussing, or balance unit. They've just covered what that does. And then you can see the list. Now, some of them have names. I believe they are Polish city names. This is a feudal levy from Poland. So I wonder if they're raised from these kind of capitals of regions. They get the name of that city, and then everything after the first unit in that section just get generic names by the looks of it. There are some options on the right-hand side. I believe they could be the objectives. It's got the bugle there, which makes me think that is the case. And we could kind of try guess what they all mean. Maybe it's defend land. The black circle one is attack a capital. The third one is maybe just always attack armies. And the fourth one is maybe stay in reserve or something like that. On the left-hand side, kind of reverse order there by me for some reason. Who knows? We won't go into it too much. It could be anything really, but it might be a little bit of a hint there towards those objectives. And then on the left-hand side, I'm not sure. I thought these were initially like the pips, like how good they were, maybe how much experience they had. But as you can see, they are in different locations. Some of them are in the middle one, some are at the top, some are at the bottom. I did think maybe that's where they are in the formation, but I would have thought this would be like turned 90 degrees and it would be, you know, long ways, horizontal, you could even say. And that would show where it is. I think that would make more sense, but maybe it's to keep the UI from getting too wide. Anyway, we don't really know. It's just an interesting thing to see on there. You can obviously see what kind of unit they are and how many people are in there as well. So quite a good UI. Again, with all of these are going to be changed before launch, at least in how they look a little bit. So we won't worry about it too much now. But then here we are, like a third of the way through this combat dev diary. So how does combat actually work? Well, it works very similar to EU4. However, there is only one main phase. So they've condensed that down a little bit. But the dice rolls that you have actually happen the same amount of times. They've just simplified the phases a little bit. And as you can see from a lot of this, the terminology is very similar to EU4, and then there's just these new features really added onto it from the sides. So the battle starts with a bombard phase. This is any unit that can bombard, typically your artillery units, and they will be able to fire on the opposing army. The artillery will do damage to the units in the opposite section they are in. So if they're on the left-hand side, the mirror of that would be the right-hand side of the opposing army, and vice versa. And then after that is finished, the main phase will start. So each section tries to get as many units to engage as their maximum frontage allows. So again, this is where I think frontage means combat width, if you want to think of it that way. There is more information later on in the dev diary, but even then, it's not super obvious what it means exactly. And I do believe Johan will clarify some of that in his replies. So on Friday's video, we'll probably get a lot more information about exactly how it works. Most of the time, every regiment will have the same frontage value, and they will attack the opposing section until there are no possible units left, and then they will hit enemies in the closest section after that. So if they wipe out the left-hand flank, they'll move into the center, and then they'll move to the right-hand side. Only engaged regiments will fight in the current round of combat, and a regiment will try fight another engaged regiment in the opposing section first, as they just mentioned. If there is no one in that opposing section, they can fight any other sections, and a unit with good flanking ability will also do more damage if they are doing these kind of flanking attacks at that point. If there's no opposing unit to engage, they will damage the morale of all regiments in that section. A bit of a kind of word salad altogether there, but basically they'll fight whoever's opposite them, and then if they're gone, they'll move on to the next section, and then after that, if there's no one they can fight, if there's more people on your side who are eligible to fight than the opposing side, it looks like they basically just damage their morale directly rather than actually damage the units themselves. So I think this is a good way to kind of complete battles where at the end, if it's getting crazily one-sided, you can just damage the morale really quickly and finish the war. Very similar to how it works in EU4, if I remember correctly. So with all this, how does the regiment actually engage? Well, at each tick, they roll a dice and roll against their initiative. If they succeed, they become engaged. The chance increases with every hour of combat as the armies kind of mesh together a little bit more. This will make you want to have every section of your army have units that are quick to engage, and then your heavy hitters can follow them in and actually get into the warfare itself. So you probably want your mounted cavalry in certain areas, try and engage the enemy, and then your slower units can get in there and do some fighting as well. Every regiment, even those in reserve, have a ticking penalty to morale every hour of the battle. This is, I think, just to prevent battles going on forever and ever. If they could just continuously be reinforced, it is going to affect their morale anyway over time. And then, as I discussed earlier, there is another section that is your reinforcements, and they basically fill in gaps that appear in the frontage of those sections. So again, if you have a gap in your frontage, a unit gets defeated, one of these reinforcement units will try fill that gap every hour, and then they will continue to fight as normal in that flank. Now, they do call out here that only enough units for the possible frontage of a battle will attempt to reinforce every hour, so having huge doom stacks is not an advantage. So I think this is how they're going to try get away from the doom stack kind of play that you see in EU4, and you see a lot of it in Crusader Kings 3 as well, having these just massive armies and just smashing them against another massive army, and then just seeing who wins. As you can only reinforce so many people at a time, depending on your frontage or combat width, again, if you want to think of it that way, you would be better served to have these additional units split out, I think, as a second army and have them doing something else, because they're pretty much just stuck in this queue behind everyone else. You can't just reinforce everyone at once. So I think this is trying to get you away from having these doom stacks, that you're kind of wasting the potential of the rest of the armies that are set in reserve. You might as well be using them doing other things, sieging down, maybe even fighting other armies, things like that, rather than having these just massive doom stacks. And I would imagine when they get into logistics next week, it's also going to cause huge issues with movement speed and things like that as well. I would think there's going to be other areas of the game that's really going to dissuade you from using these huge doom stacks. Or at least I hope so, because it is kind of stupid how it works, let's be honest. I'm not saying historically they didn't have these huge doom stacks. There's some very famous examples, but I do think trying to get away from that is a noble endeavor of the team. The broken unit section, which we will see later on, are where regiments will go once they've been routed in battle. They will no longer participate in the battle at all, even if their regiments are still part of an army that is engaged. So they all go into an area and are never seen again in that battle, but they do exist once the battle ends. They can be replenished and things like that. They've not fully been defeated. Now, one thing I would think would be cool here, if you could have a general trait or something where you could pull armies back out of that, because as it's worded here, they never come back during that battle. But I think it would be pretty cool if there was a ability to do it for like really high level generals. Maybe they could be so inspiring, these broken units could be brought back in. You know, he could go over them and say like, you know, what are you doing, king and country, etc. Get back into this battle, and they would come back in, even depleted, they'd come back and fight. Or maybe you could like consolidate them into one regiment or something and send them in. I think that would be a cool little flavor thing, or just like a cool addition. I probably wouldn't want it all the time. I think that is why they've set it up this way, but I think as like a one-off with a special commander or something, it would be pretty interesting to have that happen. And then the battles themselves, they are over when one side has no regiments, or if all the armies have retreated, or if a manual order to retreat has happened. So you can just tell your army to get out of that battle. Look, I see it's going really badly. I don't want to lose any more troops, so let's just retreat, get out of here. You'll probably lose some more troops in the retreat, but it's going to be less than if you just let the battle play out. So you might as well try save as much as you can, so that is coming back as well. And we can see here from this screenshot, this is roughly how it's going to look. So you can see the left flank, the center, the right, how many troops, I guess, are in each one. It looks like it's listing the commanders that are in each section, 3, 4, and 4. You can see the reserves. You can see the broken units they were just talking about. Discipline and military tactics, they've come back from EU4, so that's why they've not really talked about them here. It's going to work very similarly, it looks like here, and that is how the UI is going to kind of look. As with all of these, as I've said before, it will look different at launch, but that is how it looks at the moment. And as I said earlier on, there is some new terminology being used here, so they do cover it a little bit at the end. So combat speed is one of the things we saw. This is how quickly a unit can move up from the reserve section to fill a gap in your actual army. That does make sense. Frontage, this is the one that even with this breakdown, I think we'll get more clarification from Johan in the replies. This is a limited amount of regiments that can fight in each section. So topology and vegetation can reduce this, and some units may require more or less. So again, I think this is like combat width in EU4. At the start of the game, a regular 100-man sized regiment uses the same frontage as a full 3,600 men in the Napoleonic era. This is done to scale the numbers to feel properly historical, whilst also getting good gameplay out of it. So similar to how the kind of unit size they were talking about earlier on, where levies have way more men in those units just so it's more manageable. It kind of looks like that's the case with this as well. The kind of scale doesn't really change, but it kind of scales up depending really on what area you're in, and you won't really notice any weirdness out of it. But even with this, I don't think it's like super clear exactly how this works. Again, I think Johan will clarify this, or maybe it's just I don't understand it. This is like the 5th time I've read through it, and even then I'm still like, I don't really understand exactly how it works. The third one here is initiative. That's how quickly a unit can engage as soon as combat starts. Lighter units have higher initiative. So this is where you're going to want to have your cavalry units and things really charging in, getting the high initiative, implementing an engaging battle, and then playing out the actual rest of the battle after that point. And with that, that is the end of the dev diary this week. A very good one. I think some very interesting information here. It's going to be really great to see that AI kind of automation stuff we're going to get later on. Do let me know what you think in the comments down below. Hit that like button if you've enjoyed it. It helps other people find these videos in the future. And then if you do enjoy it, please do subscribe. I'm covering EU5 up to official announcement, launch and beyond, and I also cover Crusader Kings 3 in a very similar manner as well. But we'll leave it there for today, and I'll see you in the next one.